So I guess we could wait for more people, but I would be interested in throwing out, since the cloud, the AWS cloud stuff has been on my plate, but I just haven't found the time for more than the initial investigation. I would really love to switch into doing mode, like either partnering with someone or just something else at a fixed time. Because when I've looked at some of the videos that are out there, um, they are all on very simple clouds so far, right? Like we can avoid the authentication, we can avoid these mix-ins, we cannot do this. And it's like, well, that doesn't work, right? So it makes the starting point a little more, it makes the starting point, like once you can, with AWS, once we can figure out and decide what a valid starting point is for authentication, and I think it's pretty simple, then we have to start, for me at least as a beginner, to have to start figuring out how to not do any of the things that Item is doing in Azure, because it's got a different model for how you apply certain configuration, how certain filtering and in items don't or do exist in different clouds. And so it'd be really nice to sort of start from a simple cleaner slate, which seems to be the approach right now. And it seems to me like it wouldn't be hard to get to like creating a volume or creating a network interface. If we were to lay that out as an MVP and then build on that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So from a perspective of authentication, which you mentioned, we had some discussions about that this past week.
Yeah, and I'll help with that.
Yeah.
It's on my mind now too. It's what I'm going to be doing full time is writing Item AWS in POP.
Okay.
So Tyler can
a whole day or a whole week to working with you on that.
I could dedicate part of a day at a time, probably, especially you're more in the Utah time zone, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a few hours ahead of you, so I could finish up on a Monday or a Wednesday and dedicate a few hours to sitting down.
Yeah.
And that probably wouldn't put you out of your normal work time. It would be, yeah, that would be super helpful because, yeah, the starting point is easy, and adding functions will literally probably be mostly finding what parts of Bodo to use initially, right?
Right.
I get the feeling that the way we're going here, there's no real need, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no real need for anything to be set in stone, and there's no legacy being created for the first month or two. Their mistakes can be made, and no one's going to rely on this anytime soon, right?
Yeah.
No one's going. That's the no pressure, but.
I mean, yeah, but you know, 4 times probably in the last few years, I've written layers over Bodo, and it's changed, but it's fine. I think it's stabilized now. The AWS APIs are relatively stable. I think the more interesting questions, though, are things like, so I also tried to get through the POP documentation, and it is a little bit word heavy to get to the point of what is POP. And I feel like there's a grant. I don't want to be recorded saying anything that's just off the cuff here, but it feels like there's a lot being said to get to the meat of the subject there. And so I would like it if there was a briefer item, like from an item perspective. These are your first 3 things. I think the videos have started on that, but maybe a directed thing of maybe here's your cloud, here's your item, these are some situations, these are some things, that this is the current thinking, and go. Because each cloud provider's API, there's not a whole lot that's a mystery there, right? You have an end goal that you already probably know how to do via the API, and you just want to implement that. And so a lot of the pages of that document are more leisure reading and maybe less important to getting to the point of saying, okay, great, now I can execute that function.
Right. And that's what I'm trying to do with where I'm streaming on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I've been streaming the making of certain item clouds and item of Vagrant and VirtualBox. And Tom just this week wrote a new plugin for POP called Account that'll make it really easy to switch between profiles for item cloud providers. And
That's interesting. So the notion of a profile, because I was going to say that we definitely need to like, so are we also trying to enforce best practices here, or trying to figure out what best practices are in this case, not for all clouds, but let's say for AWS supports profiles. There's very little reason to do anything but say whatever AWS thinks the profile is, let's just use that and let it resolve whatever outside things. Like if you have an environment variable set, let Bodo pick that up, because that's got pros and cons, right?
And Tom will come in the meeting in just a few minutes. He's getting out of another meeting. But as soon as he joins in here, he'll go more into detail about how Account works. And he's really excited about it. He thinks it'll blow Terraform out of the water.
Is that really seriously a goal here?
It's not a goal. It's just, well, yes and no.
So,
not
I
doing
mean,
this just to blow up Terraform, but
yeah, I mean,
side effects that's really good.
I don't think that anybody's trying to be, vengeful here or anything like that, right? It's not like we're going after them, but I mean, I got excited about this last fall, mostly because, there's a lot of the workflows that I encounter in Terraform that I'm just not happy with, right? Like I wish that some things would be easier for me to work with in my duties. And, I think having the ability to sort of influence that as not a Go programmer, a Python guy, it's makes a lot more sense for me. I don't think that the goal is like, okay, burn Terraform to the ground or anything like that, right? I don't think it's going to go away, but, I think that this could become a valuable tool for people that see value in it.
Exactly.
So yeah, let's do we have a moment to clarify that? Because what strikes me as the main difference is that Terraform is declarative, but with a grasp on the sort of a third leg, where the stability comes from the fact that its state can be matched against the state and therefore a point in time snapshot of what a particular environment looks like can be matched against what the API returns. It's not just declarative, I'm going to go do things. It also has that intermediary step of saying, this is what you think it should look like. If that isn't what it looks like, then I'm not going to modify anything, because that's my safety factor. And I don't see that this provides that. Now, again, that's my perspective on the value difference here. And so I just want to understand, do you hear where I'm coming from? Like maybe I'm not describing it well, but I feel like the notion of having state is something that this doesn't. And so when we're talking about not using it or certain workflows, I have a certain very specific workflow, I should say, with Terraform, where I try to say, like, when making decisions here, Terraform creates things that don't come and go fast. Like we don't create instances with Terraform. We create autoscale groups. We create security groups, because they don't have to be dynamically wrangled all the time and trued up, essentially, in the state. And I see Salt, where we use Salt is if we want to launch an instance, if we want to run an instance, we want to do things on a bunch of systems, it hits that sweet spot while not managing the things where if I erase a file, I don't want it to accidentally go out and blow away a bunch of security groups, which yes, Salt won't do and Terraform can do, but the notion of that sort of destructive blast radius of a mistake is better, I think, gated. Like there's a better safety guardrail with Terraform. And so I'm trying to figure out where in your use case this is changing things, because for me it seems like I would still want it to have that. Delineation between the best function of one and the best function of the other. So when you say like it would blow Terraform out of the water for like accounts or something, Tyler, I was like, I'm trying to figure out where that works for me, whereas I might have done things differently than other people.
So
Tom
is in here.
That's really helpful, and that's one of the features that I've been ideating on. So really, what we need to do is make sure that and correct me if I'm mistaken. When you run Terraform, it maintains a file which tracks references to all of the objects that it has created or is maintaining. So the states that
It
you
maintains a
define,
file, or it maintains an object in a remote store, right? So you can have a shared sense of that state across the organization.
okay. Yeah, so really that's, I mean, that's, I want to say kind of the last big problem that I'm trying to tackle here is being able to maintain that shared state. I've just been debating about a bunch of different ways that we can go about doing it. So that's really my goal, probably for item 8. We're about to cut 7, which includes the account stuff. Sorry, I'm a few minutes late. That Tyler and Nick is probably already, that Tyler and Nick may have already started talking about. That allows you to maintain authorization and account automation across multiple accounts and clouds at the same time. Clouds and APIs and all that jazz. So yeah, this is hands down the main feature that needs to be addressed, is the one that you're describing. So I just want to let you know, very cognizant of it. And if it's all right, I might reach out to you for feedback or ideation as I'm trying to nail that thing down.
I guess, though, I'm asking, I'm happy to talk to you, and I don't mean to, but I'm going to be coming from I have this reaction to new things at first of why do I need it? And I think maybe I like adopting things when they make sense, but when I've already got something that does it, I'm a little more resistant. So I'm still trying to understand, like, what the need is to obviate or to do things that Terraform does well, when I feel like the times where I've seen Terraform do some of the things that we like to do with Salt, or specifically Salt Cloud, it's a minor league disaster, because hey, systems go away, they come back, cloud things should be more ephemeral, and Salt handles that very well. I feel it has a good layer of saying, I'll ask where this thing is, and when I need to look at it again, I'll just grab the state of the world and I will accommodate it. Whereas Terraform sits there and goes, these things have disappeared. I don't know what anyone did. Should I recreate them? I kind of like, I like the one step away approach that Salt Cloud has. That's a little bit looser, but it works very well with resources that can be both ephemeral and destroyed remotely without impacting anything. It's good. I do wonder why the goal is, in this case, to say maybe it's because of this. Maybe I'm coming to it. Sorry, y'all are listening to me fumble through this. But for a mature organization, hopefully, you've got a way of managing these things already. And I guess, to me, I don't want the notion of having to switch to Salt from Terraform in order to do something new. And I also don't want to have to say Salt wants to control everything or Terraform wants to control everything. There seemed to be a layer at which things had a happy median before. And I want to say that maybe I'm not seeing it. I just want to know, like, where the line is shifting in what you guys are seeing in the broader world, maybe, and why it is that you feel there's a need to have that functionality here, rather than say, oh no, this does that well, we're doing this well, it doesn't have to, cross here.
I think that there's room for multiple tools that do multiple things, right? It sounds like the way your line of questioning goes is more along the lines, well, this one thing does this one thing well, why would there ever be another product? I think especially
maybe it does, and I don't mean that you're making me sound dumber than I feel I am, but that might be okay.
No, I mean, there's going to be lots of tools that do infrastructure as code and do cloud things and do anything, right? So I think this is just another thing, and people that see value in it will use it, and people that don't, won't. Like I said earlier before Tom got on, I don't think Terraform is going to go away, right? Like, this isn't a Terraform killer, or any infrastructure as code for that matter. But I think that this could gain a solid following for people that see value in it. And in regard to the third state, it's one of those things, as you mentioned, that sometimes makes Terraform very brittle, right? It starts freaking out that things are or are not there in a certain way, and wants to blow things away and recreate them, or all of a sudden you destroyed something that you didn't intend. I think that there's some opportunity there to maybe do things a little bit better. And, we're still early on in the process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tom mentioned that he's thinking about how to tackle that third state there. You know, yes, it's not present now. It could be in the future, but when it does show up, it's going to be a plugin, right? You know, everything that comes out of Tom's brain right now is a plugin. So, you know, you could turn that on or off depending on what your use case might be. Like, you know, I am a mature organization and I want to do, you know, things that involve this third state. They give me a little bit of a safety net there and let me detect drift on things that I might not be setting inside of my local code. You know, there's some value there, but then there's also the other side of the coin, like you mentioned, in sort of the current state of Salt, and like, hey, you know, I'm just doing some stuff that's probably going to go away in a little bit. I just need something quick and dirty. I want to stand up some stuff. You know, I think that it has a very low barrier to entry on that side of the coin.
So, and one of the other things that's challenging is as we look at cloud automation today, most organizations are using quite a few tools. And they're using quite a few tools because of exactly what you're describing. Yeah, there's some things that I want that are ephemeral, Salt's doing that well. There's some things that I want that are development environment, turn on, turn off, you know, so we'll use something like CloudFormation. There's a persistent long-term state of cloud resources. Terraform does that really well. And then they come back and will say, okay, I need to, you know, maybe do system configuration, or now I need to manage a non-cloud style, you know, API, right? I need to manage GitLab or something else. And what we're dealing with right now from an overall market kind of view of what's going on in the cloud space is an insane amount of sprawl. We're all over the place as we come back, and there's a strong motivation to do things like really massive hybrid cloud deployments, manage multiple cloud instances, or sorry, multiple cloud accounts and vendors at the same time. Then there's also balancing the long-term maintenance of an infrastructure in the cloud with rapid development environments, and those end up being very different things. There's the need to integrate tools with CI/CD pipelines, right? So there's so much going on, and what I really want to do is more ambitious than what we see on the immediate horizon. What we see on the immediate horizon is, oh, hey, here's a tool and here's some merits and here's some things somebody else does. And it's really easy for us to say, I want to compete directly with this other tool, or, you know, and then say, well, why would I ever want to replace that? Which again, those are valid questions. But my goal in this isn't to say, yeah, I want to, you know, I'm going to replace Terraform. I mean, that's a fool's errand, honestly. And that's a fool's errand because, and not because it's established in the market, but because what happens from a technology perspective is that we come up with a new idea and a new way of modeling things, and then that opens up peripheral capabilities. And so if we want to be able to create a technology stack that endures, a technology stack that's able to create unification in an ever sprawling world. That's more of what I'm trying to do, and that's more abstract. I mean, don't get me wrong. And so it's tricky because we come back and, you know, we have a meeting and we say, oh, I want to do this and this and this next. And Tyler's fantastic. He's very excitable. And he's like, oh, this is going to blow this thing out of the water. And that's, I mean, it's as
I shouldn't have even mentioned
it's important to look at other tools. And say what?
I shouldn't have even mentioned Terraform.
Sorry, yeah, I think you triggered me. My bad.
Yeah, as a lot of what we do is we look at other tools and we say, what are some design limitations that surfaced with this tool? And this is a great tool, but what can we learn from it? And as we do that, again, the hope is that what we can end up with is being able to come back and say, yeah, we learned a lot from Terraform. We made some decisions which said, hey, there's scenarios inside of Terraform that make a lot of sense and work really well, and that we should accommodate those scenarios. But again, the big picture is saying, what are people actually trying to do? Instead of saying, I need to feature compare here, here, and here. And so really, Peter, your explanation is very valuable in that it helps reemphasize that some things are ephemeral, some things are persistent. Because yeah, when you're dealing with account settings, and when you're dealing with and this is a very large case across multiple APIs. I mean, we're talking about this in the sense of cloud resources today, but I would much prefer if, in the long run, item is looked at in a much broader sense, right? That it's not just, oh, I can spin up some cloud resources, but that it goes in a couple of major directions. And one is, oh, I've got a single language that I can use to manage a lot of different APIs in my tool sets and pipelines, and not just from a CI/CD and infrastructure perspective, but also potentially from a back office IT perspective, or even from a business process automation perspective, and from a development perspective. It would make a lot of sense if we were able to bring a tool, get item to the point where it would be a really simple, ephemeral tool for developers, so that somebody could come back and say, okay, if I want to set up Lambda, so if you say I want to set up a Lambda deployment right now, what do? So you make a CloudFormation config file. You go into the Amazon account and you configure a bunch of junk. You might use something like Chalice to then deploy the application, right, to Lambda and to create those gateways. And then you might use Terraform to maintain some accounts, and then you might use CloudFormation again to create a DynamoDB database and S3. And the reason that it gets bifurcated like that is because in development, you want ephemeral turn on, turn off resources that are highly portable. In production, you want persistent, long-lasting cloud resources that are tied to ephemeral code deployment and code management. So really the question that I'm trying to say is, would it be possible to say that we've got these base APIs, we've got the functionality for ephemeral and persistent mechanisms, so that what a developer creates can easily migrate into being a persistent managed system, so that what we end up with is being able to say, okay, developer, here's one tool, and it's going to set up your ephemeral on-the-fly test environments as well as automate tests, and it's nice and slick. And by the way, everything that you do can be handed over to the infrastructure team, and they can just turn it on. And if they want it to be persistent, here's a flag. This says, oh, this is persistent now. But then also being able to expose deployment and development patterns, so that it's easy to come back and say, okay, if I want to, again, I keep using the serverless model just because it's what's most recently in my mind. But I mean, let's say I want a serverless system. The goal would be that once we get the baseline functionality in, that item makes it really easy for us to make more extensions onto the platform that say, here's a tool that would solve problems similar to what serverless.com solves. Here's a tool that solves problems similar to what Chalice solves, so that we can start absorbing a lot of these disparate use cases, so that we don't end up in this situation where it's always just having to go, oh, what's the 14th tool that I've got to bring into this scenario, instead of simply saying, oh, I add that, and now I get to do what I need to do. So I mean, that's kind of what my long-term thinking and goal is. Sorry if I'm being too abstract and too verbose. But yeah, along the line that says, let's learn what Terraform does well and try and incorporate some of its functionality without sacrificing some of our other benefits. That's all. Sorry, Nick, did I go too far? And I can't
No.
make Peter laugh. This guy's face is a stone. He's like, yeah, doesn't happen.
The video cuts off right at his mouth, right? So he's like completely stone faced up top, but he's
You can
smiling
still see
underneath. You
though,
just can't, you
right?
can't tell.
You can still see that he's not smiling. This man's a hard read.
It's an interesting presentation. Again, you're dealing with different problems than I am. So for me, I'm asking a question that I understand is narrower because I'm not at the side of trying to satisfy other people's needs here. Cool. I don't want to, I feel like I've probably derailed us for the first half of this. So back on track, whatever that is. Sorry.
Yeah, so I know Tom wants to go over some new stuff. Real quick before we get into that, just wanted to give some update on some things out in the world. So I don't know if there's been any progress from Cedric. He couldn't make it today on the libvirt cloud that he's working on. But recently released an update for the Azure Provider that basically brings it feature parity plus a heck of a lot more with what Salt Cloud currently is. So that's exciting. If anybody gets a chance to check it out and give me some feedback, I would appreciate that. You know, it's going to change, obviously, with some things that Tom's working on, but right now it's in a serviceable spot to do some things. So it's at a point now where we can like run it through the ringer a little bit and keep tweaking it as new features come out. Tyler, if you want to go over the cloud board real quick and talk about some of the things that you've been popping out.
Yeah. And I do recommend if someone is making a new cloud, Azure RM was kind of a beast to start out with. to be honest. So let me see. Does that share this? Yes. So
Can you make it bigger?
Clouds, is that bigger? Is that visible?
Yeah, we don't need the stuff on the right. You can make it a little bit bigger.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I don't need to see that whole board. So these are the clouds that we're looking at porting to item. I'm currently doing, I'm starting with some of these easier ones like VirtualBox and Vagrant, where in Salt, there were only 300 lines of code. And I recommend that as a starting point because jumping into AWS will be a little bit tricky. So just as a way to get a little experience, do one like Zen or just go in and look at the VirtualBox or the Vagrant code because it's way simple. Even once it was ported to item, it was only 300 lines. So, yeah.
So the thing about like AWS is that, to me at least, it makes a lot of sense because I've been enmeshed in it for a long time. I'm probably not going to look at any other clouds yet if I can avoid it, because after looking at Azure, it didn't, like you said, it didn't really help a whole lot. It gave me the structure, but I think you've got better ways of getting into that now.
Okay.
I think for if you're I guess what I'm saying is if you're familiar with the API, something like Bodo, it's much less now about how to get Salt to do something item, because item is it's just running things and putting things into that global structure into the various into the hub, right? There's not a whole lot at this phase of just getting it to run that I need out of looking at another cloud. I just need to be able to say, what do we want it to look like at the output? Because I spend too much time just sitting in like IPython. I can run through because the Bodo 3 API is in ways fantastic, and you can just run through it consistently, easily get all the information you want. There's huge amounts of references to it. It's just about getting it into what shape it's supposed to be in. And like I said, the problem with Azure RM is it just really didn't provide a good model for that. It doesn't provide a good model because it's not a one-to-one or even sort of a one-to-one-ish mapping of the resources.
Yeah, and that's really because of the huge differences in the APIs, right? And Tyler and I talked about this the other day. Really, that's where I started. You know, I was wrapping the APIs in things that made sense for the execution and state modules. And so if you're doing something similar with AWS and you're looking at the APIs and you're looking for corollaries in Azure, it's just not there.
Right.
So yeah,
what I'm looking for with Tyler, sorry to interrupt you, was like what I'm hoping we can get to is just say, let's do a throwaway version of it, of wrapping some percentage of what is useful. And then we can look to see what it looks like rather than, I don't want to worry about matching up. Definitely not with Zen, VMware, Vagrant,
Yeah,
or even Azure right now, because once we get the pieces working, it should be really easy to refactor those out because the API comes in chunks that logically move together pretty easily. And if we need to make a major decision about how it should look to unify it or not to, it should be clear once you've done a useful chunk of EC2. Because I think just like Salt Cloud, you don't need to wrap the whole thing.
I think you had a really good point with starting with a simple object like a network interface and going from there, right? Like you're going to be creating an execution module to do the work regarding a network interface, right? Like get a network interface, list network interfaces, create, delete a network interface, you know, those simple operations. And then you're going to have a state module that wraps it. And all that does is call the stuff that does work, like creating and deletion and, you know, doing diffs on it, and then the code to, you know, do updates if you need to. That's what your state module is going to look like. So if you start at the API, you create the execution modules that correlate to that, wrap it in a state module, and you have, like, this is my simple network interface thing. That's the model by which you create all of the other things.
right. Like this is just the Vultr states. It's just two states, absent and present. And all they do, like Nick said, is call all of the other exec modules around it. But the states aren't that complicated to write. And like Peter was saying, the one of the things I found when doing Vagrant and VirtualBox and Vultr is that I couldn't port things directly from Salt. I couldn't just take that code, copy paste it, and then just rewrite it in item. I had to work backwards from the API because the API is what we're doing, and because there's a lot of stuff in Salt Cloud, like it's trying to work with Python 2 and different environments, and we just need to do things Python 3 the item way from the API up is what we found was easier. I don't know if that's what you did too, Nick. But
yeah, I mean, so when I ported over to item, all of the execution and state modules for everything other than virtual machines were already present in Salt because I wrote them. So that was an easy job to port over execution and state modules that already did stuff. Yeah, the main reason why I don't necessarily advocate for that in AWS is because I took a look at it the other day, and it's old and it's messy. So yeah, it's probably almost going to be easier to do a rewrite from scratch with using the existing execution state modules as a reference more than, you know, something to actually work off of.
So I mean, these are the clouds. Nick asked me to bring up the board. We have Azure RM, which is pretty close to feature complete. Just needs a little bit more testing, and the account stuff that Tom's doing. Same thing with VirtualBox and I guess Vagrant's in that category now too. But AWS is going to be my main focus then with Peter next week. On Monday, we'll start looking at networking, or a very simple piece of AWS that we can do first. And I'll also reach out to Cedric and see when if I can help him with progress on libvirt. But then these are the clouds. I put kind of everything in this open side, but these are the clouds that will come next. Openstack is a big one. Linode. I don't know. I don't know in what order we should plan for these, or if we even need to think about them yet until we're done with AWS.
Yeah, I think that if it could be as many people trying to contribute and assist on AWS, because there's a lot of functionality to cover there, right?
Right. And it's very widely used.
Yeah, but I think
Have to be
there's value in a lot of these other ones, right? You have some big players, like I think a lot of people out in the community are using VMware and Openstack, and then you have some other big public clouds that are competitors to AWS and Azure, that GCP and Oracle, and then you have like the smaller players that people still use, right? Like DigitalOcean and such. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of good clouds in that list. It's just a matter of how you want to prioritize them, right? Like prioritize them by ease of use or ease of creation. Might not hit all of the people that you want early on, but if you do the hard ones first, that's rough too.
I guess for me, as the one that's going to be like sitting pair programming with people that are making all the other clouds, like working with Cedric and Peter and you, Nick, for me, it was definitely necessary to start with a smaller bite like VirtualBox. But I can see if it's not what would be good for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's like what Cedric said at some points, right? Where certain things earlier on about Salt Cloud just don't map into just doing Zen, not Zen, I guess more, but libvirt, right? What he was talking about. This is way back last year. Just like, oh, it just doesn't map. It doesn't make any sense. These abstractions aren't there. And similarly, when you go from that to AWS, it's a whole different world, and the API is crufty, and it's not going to change, and it's not going to match other providers in AWS.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think of it more as I'm creating state modules ultimately for this thing to ensure it is present and in spec with what I define, rather than saying I'm trying to fit this cloud into something that was a mold that came before it.
Right. I think we'll do a lot better that way. What's the purpose of libcloud? Is that something we're going to be needing as we port more of these clouds to item?
So,
I don't think so.
libcloud's an abstraction of clouds anyway.
Okay. That was just something I was wondering, because there's always like the list nodes full and list nodes select, and list nodes select always reaches out to libcloud. Maybe that's something we just don't even worry about.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost give the same type of functionality that you get in libcloud by creating some sort of wrapper inside of item cloud,
Right.
which I know is contracts right now. But if you just had a wrapper that sort of abstracted it and say, I'm going to create a virtual machine defined in a certain way, and then you just say, I'm going to do this in AWS, I'm going to do this in Azure, it just flips and uses a different underlying API. But they're not going to map one-to-one, right? That's why libcloud only has limited value, is because you can't access all of the things that are available in the native APIs through libcloud.
So that's all I had to mention on the board. But if Tom wants to talk about account and how that works in more detail, is that something we were going to do here?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. I mean, if we've got a few minutes, looks like we do.
We always have time for you, Tom.
So yeah, I'm really sorry about that. So one of the challenges, of course, that we've got is authentication with multiple API interfaces, and also the challenge of being able to run a system that can touch multiple API instances and multiple accounts. So if we use AWS as an example, oftentimes the way in which AWS systems are set up is via multiple accounts. And one of the things that I've heard from a lot of people maintaining large clouds is that they want to be able to automate seamlessly across multiple accounts. Also that they want to, of course, be able to store credentials in an encrypted fashion, and be able to plug into other arbitrary credential stores or login mediums And so just released last night a tool called Account, or ACCT, which helps with this, and got it integrated into ITEM. Also built a pluggable mechanism via ITEM and Account where I'm going to show you guys how to use a really simple, the simple kind of built-in encrypted config file mechanism that gets us off the ground. But again, it's built to be pluggable so that we can add to the cloud support, if we want, the ability to look up native or third-party authentication systems, which again means that we can have a unified file that's encrypted and say, okay, we got a bunch of credentials here, but as it grows, there's no reason why this shouldn't be able to connect to everything from something like HashiCorp Vault to just grab your local AWS or Azure credentials as they're stored, or connecting via Google or however, right? That's the intent. But from an introductory perspective, everything's in a little encrypted config file. And so I've only got a little bit of a presentation. Again, got this working last night. And I don't quite have the docs up on it yet. So let me see if I can share my screen and not share the wrong thing. That's always embarrassing. Okay. So Account is installs a little tool called ACCT. I'm also debating about, so one of the things that I want to do, I'm really close to getting item 7 out, which fixes a few hiccups that Nick ran into, as well as adding this new account feature. And I'm also going to do I'm thinking about doing a command line revamp to make it a little more intuitive. A lot of people have already come back and expressed some confusion about saying, oh, this is where my tree is, and this is an SLS reference. A lot of people are like, can I just reference a freaking file? And so we're gonna add that in as well, so that we've got a lot of different options as to how we can execute. Okay. So do I have so let's say that I've got some Azure RM credentials. And I want to be able to do this with multiple accounts. And so we can set up a default account to say that if we don't otherwise specify, use the default account. And I'm just being generic here. These are obviously not real API keys, as I'm just pounding on the keyboard to make them. But hopefully you get the idea. So now we can have multiple profiles. And we can also come in and say, yeah, AWS and all right. So you get the idea. We can have an account that we're connecting to, a profile that has specific credentials, and then the credentials that are relative to said profile. Then using the account tool, we can encrypt that file. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Oh, that's why.
Yay, bugs.
Well, I made an improperly formatted YAML file.
Oh,
Okay. And so that then creates a new encrypted file called test.yaml.fernet. And it spits out and says, I use this encryption key. If we want, we can pass in an encryption key to use to say, so that, you know, it's not generating a new encryption key every time we do it. Otherwise, as you can see, oh, I made a new file, new encryption key. Then from item, what we can do is, so the thing that's slick is that what we want is to be able to say that we pretty much just know which credentials to use as intuitively as possible when running some states. And so again, I'll just show you the tests that I've got in here so far. So it's not super elegant yet. Hopefully in another couple of weeks, we've got some more formal examples and we've got this thing actually like working in a production environment. But so from a test perspective, I've got this one where I'm saying, hey, I'm just going to run a super simple state, and that's going to have credentials associated with it. Even though we don't have any account information, it's just gonna know which credentials to use. And in this case, the credentials it's going to use are going to be for the account state. And the default credentials. And so what it does is it says, okay, I'm inside of the states for this name. And so if this file were to say, I'm not being very creative. Okay, so if we had a state that said azurerm.compute.present, the authentication system will know when it looks up the credentials to use that API key. It's going to know because this is an Azure RM credential. This is the default one. And therefore, it's going to pass the credentials underneath this profile into the state. So then, if I wanted to use, what was the other one I had in there? If I wanted to use devsys, I can just pass that option into the state to say, I want you to use this account profile. And so again, it already knows that we're inside of Azure because you're already inside of Azure, okay? And then we can switch the profiles on a state-by-state basis, which allows us again to create a system which is much more robust about hitting multiple states. Now it uses items mod system, which was added in item 6. The mod system allows us to modify an execution right before it happens. And so this means that the account data gets detected right before the execution of the item state. It looks up the account tables and then inserts into the context for the state the specific account information that the user wants to be present, which means, again, that we can just continually hit those APIs, but hit them with the right account information and different account information in different APIs. Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, you know, every time we talk, I always talk about like how this affects the underlying code, right? So like how that gets integrated into the Azure RM modules, for instance. And the states that you were showing in that SLS file, were those were just for show, or is that something that you have to do inside of your SLS files? Like, you don't have to gather, right? This is just like some sort of test state.
Oh yeah, this is just a test state.
Okay, got it.
This is literally the test suite.
Yeah, okay.
It's the only thing I've got right now that shows that there works.
Can I,
A normal state would just look like a normal state, and it would just know. And so your question about how is this implemented in the code? So what do you need to add into Azure RM code to make this work, right?
Yeah.
Okay. This information that's underneath the profile, so API key and the key and any other values that you want to put in here, right? Okay. Anything that is underneath the profile name is going to show up in your state's context. And so if we take a look at making a state, what it would look like is that reference in the context is going to give you the right credentials. Basically, that context will have API key and foobar if this were in the right spot. Does that make sense?
Awesome. Yeah.
so is this expected to be a mandatory part of all of, it makes sense to me. I'm just asking, is it a mandatory piece of it, or are we going to have to be doing like context.get account else look for a secondary mechanism all over?
The credentials will always be in the account key.
And
I think what you're getting at is, you know, for the AWS stuff, where account makes a lot of sense, at least in the demo that was just shown, is providing the concept of profiles like you have in AWS, right? Like, I want to specify this particular set of credentials in order to do things. And I guess what you could do inside of your states is look for that, but then drop down to just letting Bodo handle it. Is that what you're saying?
Or using this to provide the desired AWS profile, because if you think about the thing in a larger like enterprise-ier kind of situation is you don't use your keys in that sense, right? They're not long-lived things. They're something that your IDN, it's going to be bridging from your Active Directory or, whatever your provider is. And so all you want to know is to tell Bodo or tell something else what your notion of that environment is, so it can get it for you, or so that it just references what is in your environment because you've initialized it elsewhere rather than storing the secret.
Okay, and that's the first thing that I said when I introduced this.
Right.
Was that the only interface I've got developed right now to make it pop up in account is the file. But what we can do is, now I've got to remember, because again, sorry, I haven't documented everything quite yet. What we can do, I'm going to just check code. That goes into account.init.gather. Okay. So, like you're saying, it's very, very common that you want to be able to grab that ephemeral token from another authentication medium. right? So say you're hitting Azure via, say you're hitting AWS with Google credentials. And so you've got to, hey, give me my Google credentials. That's how I'm, et cetera, et cetera. To do that, we have what are called account profile plugins. And so an account profile plugin would exist inside of your cloud in the same way that we add states, right? So we would say account and really it would be, yeah, say right? And so then that plugin makes it, again, really easy to say exactly what you're saying. That, yeah, we can dynamically go out and grab that stuff. And if these plugins are available, then if these plugins are available, they will be detected and used to gather those credentials. Those credentials show up in context account, which means that from a development perspective, your development is always consistent. You don't need to account for where you're getting those credentials when you're actually writing your state. So that you've got a clear separation of concerns. Does that answer your question?
It does, with one other question, unfortunately, in this context, which is that when you're doing the temporary credentials, the question, one of the things that Salt does sometimes, I think, well, and sometimes it's a little bit more mysterious, is caching of resources so that expensive API calls are reduced, whereas sometimes it does seem to just hammer them, and I've never been clear on how to control that well. Things like credentials, if you're talking about getting it from Vault, it's probably free in an infrastructure, but if you're talking about getting it from certain other APIs, it's expensive, like very expensive. And it'd be really interesting to hear what if there's a story to this that would say, hey, I can get a credential, and then this is separate from my other question. This does answer the question if there's a function to do it. My question is, how do we maybe decorate this to say only try to do this once a day unless I invalidate it, or go to a way to say if I'm going to get this from like if I decide to put stuff in KMS, which is super pricey with AWS, right? I want to get this once a day unless I've invalidated it, or, so I can default to all day having my steady credentials, but also have it sort of magically refresh once in a while and sort of do the right thing without costing too much. So I can do this in CI, so I can do this in from a salt master or from a master context, and be able to provide this to the minions that need it without hammering it on, on every pillar high stake kind of equivalent.
Okay, so the current implementation that we've got here keeps those credentials for the duration of the execution of item. Yeah, as you're describing, we definitely need to make sure there's a caching system in place. So that,
yeah, it seems like the fact that you can do encryption with ephemeral with an ephemerally generated key means that you could do something like storage while that key is in memory, invalidate it, and on restart, as long as you're not restarting 1,000 times a minute, is probably pretty cheap to free in those situations. Like, it'd be super acceptable to say on restart, get new key. If you have the key, I mean, I'm always worried about, let's not go into the failure scenarios of what happens if AWS is down, but the more practical day-to-day scenario of how do I get these back is, well, you'll just get them again. It'll download it. It'll add a few seconds to startup time, and you generate a new ephemeral key and it's stored, and then the cache can be invalidated per normal cache because it's just there.
Yes.
That's a possibility? Like, okay. Let me guess that's still sort of in the future?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of planning, in terms of planning out or thinking about it, I'd love to know more as that happens then.
Oh, definitely. Again, this is, I got this working last night.
Baby steps. Baby steps.
Hey guys, I'm sorry I've dominated a lot of this time, but I have to jump into another meeting. So I hope I hope you guys get all the stuff I've stalled done while I got to run. But it was a great meeting. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for your input.
All right, everyone, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Do we have anything else that we wanted to go over? The only other thing that was on my list that was in the channel there, last time we had talked about if there's any different ways that we can gain visibility into integration tests that are occurring for cloud currently in Salt. But we didn't really have a way forward or any other ideas on that other than potentially.
So at the last meeting, I talked to people. Anyway, we have a credential for, I think they only said the cloud working group leader could have it, but access to those results.
Okay. It's something.
So who is the cloud working group leader?
That would be me.
That'd be you. So yeah, Tyler, did you get that to him, or
Nope.
do you still have that?
Nope.
Okay, I'll look up what it is and I'll give it to Tyler and he can give it to you.
Awesome.
Sounds good.
Well, Tom, I appreciate you staying up late last night and banging out a count.
Sure.
I'm excited to take a look at it.
Hopefully I can make it more bulletproof as that was illustrated today.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that I'm finding. This is all brand new and moving fast and early stages, and every time we announce a thing, it's like, well, what about this? Like, well, yeah, we can certainly work on that. It's just, this is the first hack, and we'll keep iterating. That's how these open source things work, right?
Well, and one of the things about development is how easy it is and how often people get paralyzed in saying, well, if I can't make these million interfaces, then it's not worth the trouble. And that's a misnomer. And I'm not saying that in hostility because Peter's off the line. I'm saying that's a common trap that we all fall into, is that we say, well, since I've got to develop 500 interfaces, why bother? And to develop something big and long term, you've really got to have that big picture vision of where you're trying to go, and drive towards it, and realize that you've got to kind of take island by island as you move forward. And it's one person's job. It's one person's view and ability to say, okay, I'm going to add these features in this order, and I would argue it's then somebody else's job to say, okay, I'm going to add all the bolstering components around that, because again, otherwise it's too paralyzing. And some people are better at other things. I mean, Tyler's fantastic at banging out grains and clouds and this sort of stuff. And if you sat me down and told me to bang out a bunch of grains, I'd tear my fingernails out. And so, yeah, again, a lot of it is collaborating and trying to make sure that we cover the use cases, and hopefully I can forge a path that so that I can forge and survey that initial path and then we can come back and build a road behind it. And that's really what I'm trying to do, is to say that's how we get there. So yeah, stuff comes up, and fortunately, all of Peter's questions could be answered with, well, yeah, that's why that plugin system is there. That's why, like all the hooks are there so that we can get those things in. And that's my hope. That's what I hope good design is. Okay.
Awesome. Well,
Got to go to another meeting.
Same.
Thanks, Tom.
Bunch of meetings. But
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Good to see you, Tommy.
thanks for being here today.
Bye.
Hey, Tyler.
Yeah.
I want to hook up with you at some point before you talk to Peter on Monday. I started looking at the AWS stuff a little bit, just from a like how to break it out perspective. You know how we have the like compute and virtual machine subcomponent underneath of that, and then like network and so forth, virtual network underneath. For Azure, I was like, oh, well, what's this going to look like? And really what I ended up settling on was like looking at the API docs, and instead of having compute, which is like a library for Azure, EC2 is the corollary to that, right? So, I've mocked up a little bit of a folder structure and started playing with it a little bit. And that's kind of why I was asking you pointed questions about testing execution yesterday, is because I was like, what's this going to feel like? So I just want to show you that real quick.
Yeah. And maybe even when I jump on with Peter, hopefully, maybe there's a time when you can come on with both of us. And
yeah, Monday through Wednesday is generally really, really poor for me, but I'll see what I can do.
All right. Then sometime later today.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. I'll let you know when I'm out of meetings, then we can go from there.
Awesome. Sounds good. I'll talk to you soon.